Hey everybody, this is Lex Rofberg, and we're giving a little bit of a preamble before this episode as one of our High Holiday episodes. Initially, it was released in 2016/5777, right at the beginning of 5777 as we entered that new year. But we're re-releasing it this year because we think that these conversations about the Torah readings and Haftorah readings from the High Holidays are still relevant. And we didn't re-record new ones. As much as our ideas changed, they haven't changed so much that we have whole new takes on these texts. But we wanted to put them out there for you anyway, to, if you listened the first time, revisit, and if you didn't, to visit for the first time. So we hope you enjoy these, and send us whatever feedback you've got at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. Shana Tova, Happy New Year.
This is a special edition of Judaism Unbound, the High Holiday Readings. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Levinson.
And I'm Lex Rofus.
And we're here with a special edition of Judaism Unbound today that actually is putting together a number of shorter pieces that you can find on our website, www.judaismunbound.com, in our special section on the High Holidays. We're going to be talking about each of the traditional readings for the High Holidays and looking at them with a Judaism Unbound perspective to try to find a way to see whether these traditional readings can still be relevant to us today as we potentially look at these holidays in a new way.
All right, so we are continuing on with our next text. This is the reading for the morning of Yom Kippur, the Torah reading for the morning of Yom Kippur, and it comes from the book of Leviticus, chapter 16, almost exactly in the middle of the 5 books of Moses. Leviticus is the third book, and this is about midway through that third book. And what this passage is about, it comes from a Torah portion called Acharei Mot, which means after the death, which is referring to the recent death of Aaron's 2 sons who had brought some sort of strange fire to God. And here what we see is this very strange ritual of atonement that theoretically we trace the holiday of Yom Kippur back to. That's why this reading is read on Yom Kippur. And it's all about these scapegoats and the way in which we metaphorically, or maybe it was meant to be literal, placed our sins on these goats, one of whom would be killed and one of whom would be sent to something called Azazel, which has been interpreted in all sorts of different ways. But it's really a bizarre ritual to contemporary readers, for sure, and maybe even to ancient readers, who knows. But Dan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what this is getting at.
I don't know what it's getting at, but I'll tell you sort of what it puts me in the mind of as I think about it. I mean, first of all, in the very last part of this section, yes, you're right. The way you introduced it was that Aaron's sons are killed because they brought this strange fire, and it appears that Aaron has to make some kind of atonement. And then at the very end, it says, and then they specifically talk about Yom Kippur on the 10th day of the 7th month. That's the date of Yom Kippur. You shall do these kind of various things, and has a bunch of things that you should do. So, but that big middle section, and that sort of then it's like looked back at as that was what would have happened on Yom Kippur, this whole big atonement thing that's described with the goats and everything. And when I read it, I mean, really, my basic impression is that this is just bizarre. And I know, and I think I've read somewhere, kind of Freudian type of interpretation of this to explain, psychologically how all this kind of stuff might have been working. And I think that that's brilliant and really interesting. And probably, right, when we look at any kind of ancient ritual, there are these like psychoanalytic views that can explain to us why those were the sacred rituals. Like, where did these people come up with this stuff? Like, it wasn't random, it really did come from certain ideas and metaphors that if you really dig deep into them, they could really make some sense to us even today, right? But I want to look at it in a different way, which is that I think that the vast majority of people, including, rabbis, look at a story like this and they look at it as like bizarre. It's not something that we would want to do again today. Even if the Messiah came, hopefully he won't bring back this kind of thing because it's too crazy, and the thing that it puts me in the mind of is just that that's how a lot of people today look at what is done today in the synagogue. with exactly the same kind of astonishment. Like, do you mean to tell me that you're sitting there for, 6 hours praying to a God that doesn't exist and praying in a language that you don't really understand? And how can you possibly sit through this boredom and, yada, yada, yada? And I think that for all of those of us, or I should say those, because that's not really me, who sit in the synagogue and read this text and say, oh, what craziness there was, 3,000 years ago in the temple, would be to imagine that that's what's being said about us by the people that are not coming to synagogue, right? And I wonder, again, like I feel like if you invite people to look at it that way, then it's a wonderful text to be reading on this day of Yom Kippur, this day of personal but also communal introspection and recentering, right? And if I sit there, once a year and I read a text about how children always think their parents are crazy, then my first thought is like, yeah, my parents are crazy, but my second thought is like, oh yeah, my children must think that I'm crazy, right? And once I get to that thought, then hopefully the question is, can I forgive my parents for their craziness? And what do I have to do to sort of make it so that my children won't think that I'm crazy, right? And I worry that we don't have that reaction to texts like this. That we, when we sit at the synagogue and we read a text like this, we somehow imagine, right, that there was this old ritual during the temple times, or even more ancient than that, and it ended because the temple was destroyed. And instead, the rabbis invented this new approach called, prayer, and everything's been fine ever since. And this is the way Judaism should go on forever. And if there are all these other people that are out there saying, but we don't connect with this, that there's something wrong with them. And, again, this is a theme that we've been exploring over and over in our show. What would it be like if we flipped the lens and we said that those folks who are not participating in these services, they are dissenters, and they are actually ones who should be listened to, because maybe they're actually the first leading edge of the recognition that what we've been doing in this alternative form of Judaism is no longer working, and that we need a new alternative form of Judaism. And just as we're comfortable sitting here in the synagogue and understanding that we have a completely new form of Judaism that is totally like not at all like what's being described in this reading, that we can also imagine a time in the future where people will be doing something else entirely, and maybe they'll have a reading about how it used to be in the synagogue, and that would be okay.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And I want to take a step back and actually I want to compliment Jewish evolution, because when I look at this text, I share all of the responses that you do in terms of bizarre being an adjective that springs to mind. I would even say I'm repulsed in certain ways, like the idea of killing a goat because I and my community have done things wrongly, without getting into issues of the fact that I'm a vegetarian. But like, even if I weren't, like, that's beyond bizarre to me. It's just like really bad. And the way the history worked out, it wasn't this direct, but, over time, we discarded this ritual. And for a while, we didn't really have anything. We had prayers, I guess, but there wasn't an observance on Yom Kippur, on the high holiday season, that would resemble sort of putting our sins on some other object to hold ours, in the sense that the goats were. But then, in the Middle Ages, we came up with one. And for those who listen to the podcast, you'll recognize where I'm going. It's tashlich, which I've brought up here and there before. It's where we sort of put our sins on pieces of bread and throw them into bodies of water. So here's what I'd say about that. For many folks, that is equally bizarre, to share the adjective that Dan did, and may not be meaningful. I think that it might be superstitious, it might be bizarre, and I validate and hear that. What I will say is that I think it's a great improvement over this other version of sort of scapegoating. I mean, that's what it is. That's where the term scapegoat comes from. So I think that what this story brings up for me, it's not a story, but what this element of our text brings up for me, is that we really do have the potential to take these wonky rituals and improve upon them, contemporize them, modernize them in ways that will work for more people. Maybe it is that even those new versions like Tashlich won't work forever, and maybe they're already not working for a lot of people. But because of that precedent, I'm confident that we can say, take, our out of style bread ritual and come up with something new that will be meaningful in the future.
And one more thing to add up from that is that I think it's really interesting that I heard you describe that was like, we had this scapegoat idea, we got rid of it, we replaced it with prayer, which is a completely different thing. But then like many years, like 1,000+ years later, somebody said, hey, let's go back to that scapegoat thing, but now let's do it with bread.
Yeah.
Right. So the point is that, and maybe not, that still works today. But the point is that in addition to replacing things that no longer work, we also have the capacity to reach deep into the past and pull forward things that may work again that hadn't been working for a long time. And that's also an exciting thing. We interviewed folks about the Mayim Chayim mikveh in Boston, and in my mind, that's an example of something that, at least in liberal Judaism, had been discarded for a long time, and rightly so. And then some people realized, hey, we can reach back for it now because we've been away for it for long enough, and maybe now we can reboot it in some way that makes it more interesting and relevant for us today. And that's always something that's also in our pocket. And I would say that like one of the technologies that I think is most wonderful about Judaism that allows for that is that we have this idea of studying things we no longer practice. And that's where, I think what we're doing now in talking about these texts and imagining that it's not that like we should stop reading these texts on the high holidays. What we're asking ourselves in this series is like, can we read these texts in a different way so that they're still, useful? And if not, we should probably still read them, because that's one of the Jewish technologies, so that when the time comes when some of this stuff is relevant again, we can know about it and reach back for it, as opposed to having forgotten about it completely.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And on that note, we're going to close out this mini episode. We hope you've enjoyed this look at the Torah reading for the morning of Yom Kippur. And there's also a number for Rosh Hashanah in case you missed those and you want to take a peek, take a listen to what we had to say about Rosh Hashanah's texts. So we hope that you'll check out those other ones. You can find them on iTunes or Google Play or on our website, JudaismUnbound.com, under our Listen and Learn track of our High Holidays Unbound initiative. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.